Well, hello. My name is David Cowen, and this is going to be all about what to expect in the new 6-day version of FOR509 Enterprise Cloud Forensics and Incident Response. So, the first thing I want to point you out is that we have a nifty coin. That's right, FOR509 went out the 6th day with a Capstone challenge at the end, has his own coin. We're very proud of it. We think it looks fantastic, and the people who have received those seem to like it as well. So let's go ahead and get into this. So 4509 is a cloud security as well as a forensics class. So we're dual tracked. And so if you're thinking about your overall cloud journey, should you look at 4509? Would definitely recommend that you have the basics down to make 4509 a whole lot easier, even though we do expect that a lot of people are going to come into the class with no cloud knowledge whatsoever. So we do have a ramp up on the first day. And speaking of that first day, let's go through what are now the 6 major sections of 4509. So we start off on the first day talking about the fundamentals of cloud forensics, the things that are shared across services. We'll talk about what those are. An introduction to SoftELK, because a modified version of SoftELK that is now public is definitely something that you will be using through the course to be able to handle all of these new data sources that are now available. And then we'll end the other half of the day talking about Microsoft 365 and then talking about um, the Graph API. Then we're going to go into Azure in the next major section, and we're going to talk all about Azure in regards to doing forensics in Azure and the data sources and what they mean and how you can go through uh, everything you need to know in regards to where the logs are and especially how to analyze them, because this is the forensics class. And then we have a whole day on Amazon, walking you through where the data is, how to do the analysis, how to set up automations for automatic remediation and response. Then we're going to go into Google Workspace. We're going to go into GCP. And then we now also have a capstone challenge. So if you're looking at this and you were a 4-day student, you'd be saying, well, what are the 2 new days? Well, the 2 new days are Google Workspace, as well as the Capstone Challenge, and we've added a Kubernetes section to the end of the GCP day. So it's 6 packed days. So let's start by talking all about what's in each parts of these class. So your very first section when we go in is diving straight into SoftELK. And so you're going to learn about SoftELK, you're going to learn about how Logstash works, you're going to learn about how to use it, and actually how to make your own dashboards. Now, I've met a lot of people when they first either are looking at this class or they're looking at SoftELK in general, and they're saying, "Look, I've used Kibana a couple times. I've maybe done a couple of basic queries, but I don't really feel comfortable." Well, that's what this first lab is to get you comfortable with Kibana, how to use it to analyze data, how to build visualizations, and how to build dashboards out of those, so you're ready for the rest of the course. Because SoftELK and Kibana are a really core component of this course, because what we're focusing on are all of the new data sources that are available in the cloud that you didn't have access to before. In other words, this is not a repeat of 500 and 508 in that we're going to be explaining how to do the same endpoint analysis, but now in the cloud. Instead, what we're going to be doing is talking about all of the new cloud based data sources and logs that you can go through and analyze in order to track down an incident. And so we've with the SROC team at SANS built out Logstash configurations that are now in the public SoftELK repo, where you can ingest in AWS CloudTrail logs, GCP logs, Azure logs, GWS logs, UAL logs from Microsoft 365, and more, and now ingest all of those into SoftELK, including all of the different net flows from the different clouds. Eric Taylor says, "Does this have a new GX cert?" Not yet. We are very hopeful that that is coming. We're certainly hoping that that is going to be the case, but nothing we can announce just yet. Let's move into the next major section. So when we looked at this, we said, what's too little, what's too much when it comes to the cloud fundamentals. So we decided to focus on 2 things. So one, MITRE ATT&CK matrix. let's look through all the common attacks that we see in the cloud, talk about kind of what's in scope for what you're going to be worried about, what the logs can be able to tell you. We then talk about DFIR in the cloud, some of the new things you can do with the cloud that you couldn't do before, things that enable DFIR in the cloud. And then we're going to go through some common cloud concepts that are kind of standard throughout every major cloud. That way you can understand the technologies, and you can, you both get a ramp up on it if you have not dealt with it before, but also get it into context across the different clouds, and including kind of a Rosetta Stone that you're going to see on our poster, which, by the way, hopefully at the summit we'll have our new posters for cloud forensics, to be able to translate between the services. And so we talk about things like the shared responsibility model, but also things like how to access the cloud, how to make snapshots, how snapshots work, net flow, pricing, and terminology. So moving into Microsoft 365, we're going to talk about how to connect in to actually run your queries and pull your data. We're going to talk about the UAL. We're going to talk about searching the URL. We're going to talk about log delivery times. We're going to talk about Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, everything that you want to know in order to do your analysis. And then even talking about Azure Active Directory authentications, and what different mail clients leave behind. So the difference between using OWA, Outlook, or let's say an IMAP client. Is it possible for output from the CrowdStrike CRT tool? Yes, it is possible, and we do talk about the CRT tool at the end of the next section. Um, will there be a certification attempt with the new 6-day course? As soon as there is a certification announced, I am sure there will be a certification attempt enabled. Um, Is there a way to provide students capability to provide evidence collection? We do have a new live lab that you'll see on section 4, which is GWS, where we do allow students to do live capture. And then in our GitHub, for509.com/GitHub, you can actually see that we have scripts for pulling logs from all of the major providers. Terraform code isn't needed to pull down evidence. So then we move into our next major section, talking all about the Graph API. We talk about SolarWinds because that was kind of the one of the first major incidents where we actually saw the Graph API being publicly abused by attackers, and some of the some of the interesting ways that they managed to use it for collection and persistence. And so when we're looking at that, we decided, a lot of people probably don't understand enough about both how the Graph API works, number one, but two, what it leaves behind. What can we actually detect from a DFIR perspective? So we built out a Graph API section that covers the process of actually getting an application added into Microsoft 365, the process of adding the permissions to it, what you should be able to detect if that's occurring, how you can find it, and then what evidence it leaves behind, not only from its creation and permissions, but from the accesses that occur. So we go through what it looks like if someone's using the Graph API to read people's emails, to create user accounts, as well as some resources if you wanted to use the Graph API for your own automation security needs. The next major section is all about Microsoft Azure. So we're going to be talking about the terminology of Azure, because Azure has a different terminology to AWS as it does GCP. We're going to break down subscriptions and how they work, as well as the resource manager. We're going to be talking about resource groups, how to break down a resource ID string, and then the most common attacks in Azure. We're going to be talking about Azure Compute next, all about VMs in Azure, how to find cryptominer VMs in Azure, how to understand Azure virtual networks, network security groups, NetFlow logs inside of Azure. Is Graph API the same as GraphGL? No. Graph API is a endpoint to the Graph API that Microsoft makes available to allow for unified API access to all of their different endpoint services. So then we're going to have a lab all about using SoftELK with Azure Logs. So now you get to actually walk through, just like you did in the prior lab, walking through the UAL and walking through what link is left behind from the Graph API. You actually get real logs out of Azure, and you're going to be doing the analysis to determine what happened. And then in the next major section, this is log sources for IR. You're going to go through what we call tenant logs. You're going to learn about log analytics. You're going to walk through a lab, all of going through the password spray attacks. You're going to look at the subscription logs. You're going to be looking at a lab that helps you track down VMs being created and deleted. And then a really interesting lab all about flow logs and storage logs and accesses to Azure buckets, which I don't think people pay enough attention to. I think a lot of people think about AWS buckets in S3, but many people don't really think about the same types of attacks that can occur inside of Azure and GCP. And so we have labs that cover all of those as well. Then we move into how to actually bring in endpoint logs into storage. So you have all of your endpoint logs as well as your cloud logs into one place in the cloud. So we talk about the agents that are available both for Linux and Windows. We talk about how to bring that data in. We talk about how to actually search for that data within the cloud, as well as how to bring that into SoftELK. We talk about Linux logs, bringing in web server and IS and application logs, and then an interesting feature in Azure called VM Insights. And then we finish the Azure section talking about snapshots, creating your own forensic VM, running forensics tools, moving your forensic VM around the cloud, kind of some of the things you need to know, and then other resources you need to know about things like Azure Sentinel, the Microsoft Azure playbooks, and other recommended projects. So this is another full day. Hi, Scott. And if you have questions, feel free to ask them in the chat or in the thread where you are. I'll see them and answer them as we go. So next, we're going to be talking all about AWS. So inside of AWS, we're going to be talking about AWS organizations because AWS organizations are very different than, let's say, Azure tenants or GCP accounts. So this is very much one of those things where you have to kind of understand kind of how things work. I'm not comfortable working with the current VM. Is it possible to provide a GUI-based VM? Blah, blah, blah. I'm pretty sure that is something we can talk about later on. But there is a GUI in Kibana in the 4509 VM. But as far as loading the logs and doing things, you have to do that through the command line. So we have talking about IAM in AWS. We're going to talk about different ways that someone can access your tenant, just like we did in Azure. We're going to talk about the shared responsibility model for Amazon and how it works. And then we're going to talk about CloudTrail. We're going to talk about CloudTrail insights. We're going to talk about hunting in CloudTrail. We're going to talk about guard duty. We're going to talk about how to break down API keys inside of AWS accounts. Talk about how to go deeper down into ARNs and break down who's accessing what, helping you to understand how to fully take apart these logs. And the reason that we have such a focus on logs, and this is a good time to talk about this, is when we did our research in kind of building this class, what we realized is that there are lots of data sources out there to tell you how to configure the cloud. There's lots of data sources out there that tell you how to build out some automations for the cloud. There's lots of data sources out there that walk you through Terraform and setting up parts of the cloud. But what we found the least amount of data for was people breaking down how to understand the logs generated from activities on a daily basis in the cloud and how to actually understand the components within it. And there wasn't any kind of data sets like there are on the endpoint side where there's tons of CTFs and challenges and images out there for people to study and use and learn from. So instead, what we were stuck with is, okay, there's a missing piece here, and the missing piece is how do you teach people how to actually go through logs that would show the signs of attack so that when they actually have a real incident, they can go through and break these things apart and say, okay, I know what's happening here. This is an attack. they took this credential, it was used here, they got access to their account, this is what's possible, this was in scope, and all of those things around helping them to kind of fully understand the incident and understanding what all of these things mean, because these logs are deep, they're complex, and they can be very nested. And what I mean by nested, I mean it could be like structured JSON with three levels of objects that are kind of stacked within them, that if you do not understand how things work and understand how the logs are structured, you're going to be lost fairly quickly. And so we didn't find another class out there that even covered these topics. All the classes and all of the courses and all of the online learning that we've seen is all focused on configuration and automation. So that's really the main focus of the class. So next, when we're talking about networking VMs and storage, we're talking about EC2 and EBS inside of CloudTrail logs, what they look like when someone makes a VM, what it looks like when someone's accessing disk, what it looks like when someone's making snapshots. This is definitely something we see attackers using as well as defenders. And then what EFS looks like. EFS, if you've never used it before, is like the network file system or NFS shares, where you can have a singular repository of shares and a central place for all your VMs or containers to be able to write data to. And then we have a lab that walks you through tracking down VMs and understanding what the logs are showing and breaking down what kind of VM is being created and then what it has access to. We then go into VPCs or virtual private clouds. We talk about subnets and gateways and load balancers, moving then into flow logs and then what you should expect from flow logs. We talk a little bit about Route 53. This is definitely an area we're going to be expanding into the next major version of the class, probably end of year, maybe beginning of next year. And then talking about a lab where you walk through VPC flow logs in AWS. Now, one of the neat things that, again, working with SRock, we were able to do is normalize all of the different flow log outputs from the different clouds into one major rule set, which means that while your cloud control plane logs, let's say CloudTrail AWS or GCP logs or Azure logs, are going to be in their own indexes. With flow logs specifically, you can combine all the flow logs from all the clouds into one index, meaning that you can actually see the network connections that are occurring across all of them in one place. So if you're looking for connections and correlations, it'll certainly allow you to do that. Then we talk about S3 buckets. We talk about how to use them in IR, some of the interesting ways that you can use them to augment your IR for things like transfer acceleration and centralized storage. We talk about access policies and access logs, and then we actually break down not only doing S3 analysis of showing kind of buckets being created, but also into the storage access logs, the where we actually show not only what a public access looks like, but also showing the changes in policies being created against the bucket that would have allowed it to take place so that you understand how to be able to go back and break down those policy changes. We have a whole section on AWS native log searching. So talking about Glue and Athena, breaking down and a refresher of all your AWS log sources, and then talking about AWS Detective. If you've never used Athena before, Athena is a pretty amazing technology from AWS that allows you to search logs and unstructured data in place within an S3 bucket. In future versions of the class, we'll probably be working in some data lakes and some other things, but this is solid. These are the things that I use when I do an AWS investigation. Oh, and Viv is announcing that the poster hopefully will be available at the DFIR Summit. So if you weren't planning to go to the summit, or if you're just wanting to stop by and see what you can pick up swag-wise, our new Cloud Forensics poster that kind of summarizes kind of the most important things that we think you want to know from a cheat sheet perspective in dealing with cloud forensics, it will be there and available, as well as some neat stickers with our coin on it. We then go into event-driven response. Event-driven response is a AWS term, meaning that you can automate your response and your containment as well as your investigations based upon triggers, events that occur. So we walk through lambdas, we walk through step functions, we walk through event triggers, and then we go through a couple of public projects that actually develop these concepts into response models and automations for IR, so you can understand how they work. And then we give you links to be able to go in if you wanted to experiment with them yourself. And then we have a section on in Cloud IR where we talk about how to create your own forensic VMs. We talk about in cloud versus on-prem investigations, pros and cons. We talk about AWS Systems Manager, ways to capture Linux and Windows memory at scale. And then we talk a little bit about Kubernetes before we go into a lab where you actually will go through an attack that involves lateral movement within AWS. Again, here, when we're talking about lateral movement, we're talking about lateral movement not using endpoint accounts because there's no difference there, but lateral movement using cloud native technologies that would be completely removed from the endpoint. The endpoint wouldn't see anything other than the action, and you wouldn't know how it took place or where it came down to. Should I take vendor specific courses such as AWS Security Specialty to get the most out of this course? Um, AWS security specialist certainly covers a lot of things in depth, but it's more about the configuration of those services and not really about how to interpret the logs generated from an attack. So I would say, Sean, that if you wanted to, you certainly could take that course first. And certainly being able to speak and understand AWS terminology will make the day much easier for you. But I wouldn't say it's a requirement in any way, shape, or form. Will you provide an example forensic VM? There Oh, to upload to the cloud? No. That is not something that we can do, but you could just take the Windows VM, the SIFT VM, or the Linux SIFT VM that SANS provides, and you could just upload that into the cloud as well. At that point, it doesn't really matter what VM you're uploading. It's one that has the tools that you want. The SoftELK VM is not so much for uploading into the cloud, it's more for extracting logs from the cloud and running it. Now, you could run SoftELK in the cloud and just put the logs into there as well. So that's going to be completely up to you. All right. So now let's move over into Google Workspace. So this is a new section that we've added into the class to be able to continue to expand the content. We were looking kind of what other major topics should we be covering other than having a Capstone multi-cloud intrusion, and looking at the market and who's using what. Other than Microsoft 365, the larger entrant into that collaboration space really is Google Workspace. So we realized and we knew early on that this was a missing piece for us. So we talk about kind of the history of Google Workspace, how it covers. We talk about Google Workspace services. We talk about the different editions and the logs you're going to get, as well as how permissioning works and IAM works in Google Workspace, so you can understand how to be able to track who has access to what when you're probably scoping an incident. Sec 441 covers a lot of attacker techniques and threat hunting. Does 509 cover threat hunting as well? We talk about hypotheticals you could use for threat hunting, but we're really much more about log analysis after the attack rather than proactive searching. So that's a great question. If you're thinking about it, Sec 541 is going to be a great class to take if you're looking to have some Terraform templates to use to deploy things to the cloud, to see what's happening live out of the cloud, to be able to try to find things that are occurring. Our class, the FOR509, because it is a forensics class, is all about post breach, after the bad things have happened. How do you go back and pull down the data and interpret the data to determine what happened after? So that's really the big difference between the classes. But thanks for the question. So we move from there into Workspace admin logs. Talking all about what logs get generated, how they work, where they get stored, and then we talk about how to access them because there's a huge difference in Google Workspace between accessing the logs via, let's say, the web portal versus getting them from the API. So then we talk about how to get the logs, preferably from the API, so you can skip a lot of the limitations of the web portal. We talk about what those logs should contain, how to get those logs into GCP logging buckets, so that way we can actually download them and be able to do our forensic analysis, and then how to actually set that up, and then the script that Megan wrote in order to be able to pull down those logs, which we provide in our GitHub and you actually use in class. So next we go through attacking Workspace. So we start talking about some of the different kinds of major attacks we see in GWS. So the first one is an email compromise investigation, and we talk about how to track down logs inside of both the Google Workspace email search as well as Google Vault, and then moving into a BEC lab in Google Workspace. From there, we start talking about OAuth. And for those of you who have been doing a lot in the space, you'll know that OAuth attacks, where people are basically being phished into clicking on and trusting applications from third parties that provide access to their GWS accounts, are quite prevalent. And so we actually have a whole section and a lab showing how to be able to find these OAuth attacks and find who was trusted, what permissions were given, and then how to actually track down who all within your organization in total has allowed OAuth access into their account. And then we go into a section all about Google Drive and takeout, so you can track down what it looks like when someone's actually taking data from your Google Drive, and if users actually requesting either a takeout for themselves or for an entire tenant. So the end is a live cloud lab. It's our first live cloud lab that we're experimenting with, where you actually go in and use the SoftELK VM to be able to gather logs from a logging bucket and be able to see how to set up the environment, how to provide the credentials, how to inspect what bucket exists, and then how to download the bucket contents themselves, both with and without a date filter. Moving into the second to last of the sections, we round up the lectures with GCP, starting with understanding GCP, how organizations work in GCP, GCP resources, talking about IAM in GCP, which is kind of a mind bender and something that you really need, I think, someone to explain to you. There's a lot of resources out there on this, but it's definitely different than the way every other cloud does IAM, and it will mess with you and cause huge delays in your investigation if you do not understand it. And then we have a lab where you're going to actually walk through GCP. No coverage of Oracle or Alibaba Cloud. That's a great question, Venkat. So we looked at the market and we said, who has the biggest market share? Where are the most incidents occurring? So we looked, and the major three. So AWS has over 50% of the global market. Azure is a solid second. And then third, right now and growing, is GCP, with the two major collaboration services being Microsoft 365 and GWS, Google Workspace. So right now, Oracle and Alibaba do not have enough of a market share to have a place in the class. I've also haven't heard great things about doing forensics in Alibaba. I've been told that there's not a lot of log data to go through, so it might be a depressing section to begin with. Um, but as you know, as the future changes, as market share changes, as we start seeing more things happening in those, maybe we'll either change that, or maybe this will be like the original, 408, 508, 500 scenario, where this class becomes so big it becomes multiple classes. 509 exam on the horizon. We certainly hope so. Nothing has been announced, nothing is official, but our hope is that there will be a 509 certification in the future. And this class, this 6-day version, would be what would be covered by any kind of cert like that. So from there, we'll talk about GCP logging. GCP logging is also very different to the other clouds. GCP has a logging API. It's a whole logging service and pipeline, which is very different from how the other clouds work. And when I say that, I mean that other clouds have logging services that are devoted to that cloud. GCP kind of changes the paradigm, and it's more like a Kafka or Fluent D, where you can basically just route any kind of data you want into the pipeline, and then you define exactly what gets stored and how. We'll talk about Log Explorer, which is GCP's way of searching logs, just like Log Analytics inside of Azure. We'll talk about Log Explorer queries, some things you need to know. We'll talk about how log routing and log storage works, and then how to export logs out of GCP and into another platform. So everything there that you need to know. From there, we move into talking about snapshotting in GCP. We talk about the logging agent and the op agent GCP to bring endpoint logs in, and then talk about storage buckets in GCP, as well as what your bills would show to help you as a last ditch effort to be able to track some possible exfil, followed by a lab focused on storage logs. See, I believe Oracle Alibaba would be great GIAC gold paper topic for sand students. I completely agree. I I would love to see that. So next we talk about GCP network forensics. This is kind of the next section of gotchas. If you have not done this before, I don't understand it, or you definitely need to have kind of a primer on how network forensics work in GCP, especially with how their flow logs work and the limitations there. We talk about firewall rules. We talk about how to do packet mirroring in GCP. And then we end with a section on Google Cloud forensics. So just specifically on network forensics and flow logs in GCP. And then the end of the lecture portion is all about Kubernetes. So right now, in the current state of the class, we have a Kubernetes architecture interview. We talk about the logs that are available from Kubernetes. We talk about how Kubernetes works in each of the major clouds. We talk about how each of the major cloud providers is actually configuring logging in Kubernetes. So what will be there by default and what weren't. And then we talk about attacks on Kubernetes and on cloud-based Kubernetes and some case studies we've seen publicly of how Kubernetes attacks work, so that way you know what to look for inside of your logs, which leads to the end of the 6 days where you actually get to go through and work a whole day in teams, a multi-cloud intrusion. Now, for me, as the person who got to make this capstone challenge, this was something that I really wanted to make sure we got right, because one of the things that we're seeing is that very few organizations are only in one cloud. In fact, most organizations we know of are at least in two, if not all three or more major clouds. So we didn't want to have an intrusion that isolated the different clouds together, because we're seeing that more and more organizations are using some kind of single sign-in source to allow centralized authentication to the clouds, where one account or one cloud can lead to the compromise of the others. So what we wanted to do was create a fictitious organization that actually was in all three clouds, that had that centralized sign-on authentication, and then allow students in teams to be able to work through together what happened, how each cloud was breached, where the pivot points came from, how the access occurred, and then working back towards root cause. We've had our initial alpha class go through it. We just had our first public class go through it. We've had rave reviews about how the capstone was structured, about the services that were being used, about what you're able to see and how you're able to see it now before you see a real incident. Um, I'm very excited for more people to be able to work through this. I've looked across the internet for quite some time, looking for some other data set like this, looking for some other training data set, or either publicly or privately available, that would offer something like this, to be able to see what the logs look like when you have this kind of typical modern cloud deployment of a multi-cloud organization with single sign-on, and how you would track an intrusion through it. And I think this may be the only thing that I can find out there. So you can take home this coin if your team wins. And we very much are looking forward to more students kind of coming on board and trying this out and being able to see what these logs look like. So what's next for 4509 in our future? Well, we're definitely looking for more Kubernetes. So we're looking to bring in more about Kubernetes logging, more about some of the Kubernetes attacks and analysis possibilities in Kubernetes, uh, mainly because what we know is that more and more people are moving to a container model, and there's just not enough DFIR resources and how to analyze the intrusions. Just again, lots of configuration. And then we're trying to figure out how to work in more in-cloud labs. And out of all the labs that I have talked about across all the 5 days, only one allows for in-cloud live access. All the rest are actually offline within the VM with previously acquired logs. And the reason for that is multifold. We want to make sure the class was resilient. We didn't want a small change by the provider, which they could do at any time, to actually break a lab or have the instructions become out of date. And more importantly, we didn't want internet access issues at a venue where the training is being provided to actually prevent you from being able to complete the labs and achieve your learning goals. But we're looking to see what we can do, and we're working with SRock and SANS to figure out how to build out these optional labs that allow you to start interacting more with these live clouds to be able to do things. But again, the focus of this class, the focus of your learning is going to be all about the logs that are generated that you've never seen before, hypothetically, that are being generated out of these hypervisors, these control planes for all of these major clouds that we just talked about. Because that to me is the missing piece. The missing piece for in education right now for investigators and responders is where these logs are, what these logs mean, and actually how to analyze them to be able to figure out what happened. That's what we're hoping to fix. That's what we want to bring to you so you can actually solve the investigations that are brought to you. So what if you took the 4-day version and you're like, oh man, now you have a 6-day? Well, we have great news. Normally, SAN says, hey, if you took the course once, you can take it a second time for half off. But knowing that we pushed out the 4-day version and the 6-day version came out a year later, we worked with SANS and we said, what could we do to give our alumni something special, something that shows them that we don't want them to feel left out and we want to give them an even better opportunity. So SANS agreed that you only have to pay for the 2 days of new content. So you pay for 2 days new content. You get the whole 6-day class. You get all of the updates. You get the new GWS section, and you get to actually do the new day 6 challenge. Now, what if you wanted coin and you took the 4-day? Well, one, obviously, you could just retake the class and win the challenge. Two, you could wait for Net Wars to have a 4509 section and go and play Coinslayer and prove that you have the resources and abilities to be able to solve all the questions. And then lastly, this is something that I don't know if a lot of people know that happens with some of the instructors. If you actually contribute something that we can bring into the class from a script perspective or a white paper covering something unique or novel about the cloud, the course authors will get together and see whether or not we want to award you a coin for what you've done, not only for our class but for the community at large. So there's certainly a lot of different ways to do this, and we don't want you to feel left out. So, what other questions do you all have? Because that is the 6 major sections. That's Microsoft 365, Azure, AWS, Google Workspace, GCP, and the final challenge. There's always a bit of a delay. Yes, we know that Josh, who's one of our co-authors, is also one of the people who generates content for NetWars. So we are expecting that we'll get that. If there's no coverage across cloud, how can I work a day 6 challenge? That's the point, Venkat, is that you're going to see in the logs what it looks like, and you're going to take all of that knowledge from each of the days to know what you're looking at. It'll make sense when you do it. Will there be an associated GX exam? I think that's probably the most asked question of the day. Not publicly announced yet, Harold, but we are certainly hoping that there will be one soon. If you have any other questions, now is the time. If not, you should take this course. Santi, I think I would love to have you in class. All right. Well, I want to tell everybody, thank you very much for watching and attending today. Um, I thoroughly enjoyed being able to answer your questions and working through all of our new changes with you. And I hope that you see the value in what we put together. We, as far as we know, are the only class out there on actual cloud forensics. So you really don't have a lot of options, but eh, we hope that we're the best option for you. So looking forward to seeing you soon. And yes, the class is live online. The class is on demand, as well as we'll be teaching the class in person. So you should expect to see someone around the world in the near future bringing this class to you. The next run of the class is going to be at the SANS DFIR Summit in Austin. That is going to be a big fun class. There's going to be lots of fun stuff. All of the course authors will be there if you wanted to ask questions. And I think they're about to open up the wait list and let some more people in because right now the class is sold out. So if you were wondering whether or not you could still take it and get in, that's the next one. After that, you should be looking at um, network security. I'll be teaching there at SANS Network Security. I'll be teaching at DFIR Europe in Prague, and as well as CDI. CDI. So hopefully soon they'll be opening up. Let's see. Prereqs. Um, we built the class for people who had no real cloud experience and knowledge and to be able to quickly ramp it up. Obviously, if you have some cloud knowledge, the class is going to be a lot easier for you. You're gonna feel way better about what you're doing day to day as you're working through it. Maybe it's just learning Kibana and Elk. It's going to be your major challenge. But we knew that we were going to have people coming in who do not have any prior cloud knowledge. All right. Well, everyone, thank you very much for your time and attention. Looking forward to seeing all of you in class.